One prison crams more than 150 men into a single cell. Another keeps its lights on 24 hours a day. One won't even allow families or lawyers inside, while another has been linked to one of the deadliest prison systems in America. These are the prisons many believe are worse than death. Picture a building the size of 57 football fields, surrounded by 30-foot walls, thick enough to withstand a siege, 2 rings of electrified fencing, 19 guard towers, and gravel floors engineered to make every single footstep audible. No natural light, no phone calls, no letters, no visits from family. The lights inside never go off. That is CECOT. And inside that facility, each cell holds, on average, 156 human beings. The Terrorism Confinement Center, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, is a maximum security prison in Tecoluca, El Salvador, built in late 2022 amid a large-scale gang crackdown. The man behind it is President Nayib Bukele, who rode into power in 2019 and transformed El Salvador's approach to crime, from policing into something closer to total war. He declared a state of emergency, suspended constitutional rights, authorized mass arrests without warrants, and built the infrastructure to warehouse the results. With a capacity for 40,000 inmates, CECOT is the largest prison in Latin America, and one of the largest in the world by prisoner capacity. As of early 2026, estimates suggest approximately 15,000 to 20,000 people are held there, though exact figures are difficult to verify, as the government restricts independent access. The facility was constructed within months, an unusually fast timeline for a structure of this magnitude. Speed, not comfort, guided every decision. The Salvadoran government reported construction cost as around $100 million. That's remarkably small for what's inside those walls. But when you're building cells without mattresses, exercise yards the size of broom closets, and bathrooms that serve 80 people at a time, costs stay low. You're building a warehouse, not housing, and it is now the most copied prison model on the planet. Leaders from across Central America have toured the facility, posed for photos, gone home and announced plans to build their own versions. The CECOT blueprint is spreading. Now here's what the numbers don't tell you. CECOT has a capacity for 40,000 inmates across 8 cell blocks, with cell space covering 2.4 hectares, an average of just 0.6 square meters of space per prisoner. To put that in perspective, the BBC noted that CECOT does not adhere to the Red Cross International Standard that recommends each prisoner receives at least 3.4 square meters of space in a cell. That's less than the footprint of a standard office chair. You can't lie down without touching another person. You can't stand without bumping into someone. You exist in a permanent state of physical contact with dozens of strangers, breathing recycled air, listening to the constant noise of 156 men, crammed into a space designed to hold maybe 30. The cells are equipped with 4-level metal bunks with no mattresses or sheets, 2 toilets and 2 wash basins for 156 people. Do the math. 2 toilets serving nearly 160 human beings. The line never ends. Privacy is a concept that stops existing the moment you step inside. You sleep on bare metal. You use the toilet while dozens watch because there's nowhere else to look. You wash your face in a basin that's been used by 80 other men since it was last cleaned, if it's been cleaned at all. Critics have described the institution as a black hole for human rights. The prison confines detainees in heavily crowded cells for up to 23.5 hours a day. That half hour of freedom happens in concrete exercise yards surrounded by walls so high you can't see over them. Just like the cells, the yards are packed. Hundreds of men shuffling in circles, searching for space to move, breathing fresh air for 30 minutes before being herded back inside for another 23.5 hours. The director of the facility reportedly told the first group of inmates, right on their first day inside, exactly what to expect. One detainee recounted that the first thing told to him and other inmates by the prison director was that they would never see the light of day again, and that he would make sure they would never leave. Not rehabilitation, not reform, not even basic human dignity. Just the promise that this cell, this metal bunk, this crush of bodies would be your entire world until you died. By March 2026, more than 500 people had died in custody. Since the beginning of the state of emergency, 500. That's not deaths across the entire prison system. That's deaths tied directly to the emergency measures and the facilities built to house those swept up in mass arrest. Causes of death vary. Some die from medical neglect, some from violence, some from the sheer stress of existing in conditions that break the human body and mind. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights stated that El Salvador's security policy might amount to crimes against humanity That's not activist rhetoric. That's an international body with legal authority making an assessment. Based on documented evidence, crimes against humanity, systematic, widespread, targeting a civilian population. The language is precise because the evidence supports it. But here's the twist: CECOT works by one measure. El Salvador's murder rate has plummeted. Homicides dropped from among the highest in the world to near the lowest in the region. Bukel's approval ratings soar. Salvadorans walk streets they avoided for years. Businesses reopen in neighborhoods once controlled by gangs. The terror that defined daily life for millions has lifted. So the question becomes, what price is acceptable for safety? How many people can you lock in cells with 155 others? Before the cost exceeds the benefit, how many deaths in custody are justified? By fewer murders outside, CECOT represents a trade. Freedom and human rights for security and order. El Salvador made that trade. And other countries are watching the results, weighing the costs, and deciding they want the same thing. El Encuentro is a maximum security prison in Santa Elena, Ecuador. It opened on November 11, 2025, when it accepted a transfer of 300 prisoners from the La Roca prison. Ecuador's President Daniel Noboa had announced the plan the year prior, stating both prisons would be modeled on CECOT, not inspired by, not influenced by, modeled on. The blueprint copied the philosophy imported, the entire system transplanted from El Salvador to Ecuador's coast. But the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights flagged the situation as deeply alarming. Even before the prison had finished being built, construction at El Encuentro had not even been completed when the first inmates arrived. Hundreds of men transferred into a prison that wasn't finished yet, walls still being painted, electrical systems still being tested, security protocols still being written, and inmates already locked inside, occupying a facility that existed in a state between construction site and operational prison. No oversight, no lawyers on site, no family contact. The facility opened in a legal and logistical gray zone, where inmates disappeared from the regular prison system into a building that technically wasn't ready to receive them, but did anyway, because the political pressure to show results exceeded the practical concerns about whether the place actually worked. The detention center began operating under rules that sharply limit contact between inmates and the outside world. Neither family members nor lawyers are allowed to enter the prison, with legal consultations conducted exclusively through remote, digital channels. Not face-to-face meetings in a visiting room, not conversations, where you can pass documents or touch hands through glass. Digital, remote, mediated through screens and connections that work when the internet works, which isn't always. Imagine trying to prepare a legal defense through a video call that drops every 10 minutes. Imagine trying to maintain a relationship with your children through a screen they can barely see you on. Imagine your lawyer attempting to explain complex legal strategies through a connection with a 2-second delay where half the words get garbled. That's El Encuentro's version of access to counsel and family. No media, no journalists, no human rights observers. No independent verification of anything happening inside those walls. The government controls the narrative completely, because nobody outside the government gets past the front gate. Independent verification of how the prison functions has been impossible, as no media or oversight organizations have been granted access since operations began. People are locked up nearly all day. They have their meals, exercise, and even use the toilet within their shared 4-person cells. Unlike CECOT's mass cells of 156, El Encuentro uses smaller units. 4 men to a cell, but they're still spending 23 hours a day in that cell. Eating, sleeping, using the bathroom, all within a space the size of a typical bedroom. The 4-person cells create a different kind of psychological pressure than the mass cells. In CECOT, you're anonymous in a crowd. At El Encuentro, you're trapped with 3 specific people, unable to escape. Their presence, their smell, their habits, their moods. Conflicts that would dissipate in a larger group concentrate in a 4-person cell. Nowhere to go, nobody else to talk to, just 3 other men. Day after day, week after week, with no variation except the 1 hour, when you're moved to a slightly larger cage for exercise. The government has acknowledged similarities between El Encuentro and CECOT, but analysts point out a critical difference. While El Salvador paired harsh confinement with a nationwide labor initiative offering job training and work programs, Ecuador's system offers no comparable rehabilitation programs. Just the isolation, just the walls, just the waiting. CECOT, for all its brutality, at least pretends toward a theory of reform. Inmates can participate in workshops, learn trades, work jobs that generate small incomes. It's minimal and the working conditions are exploitative, but it exists. El Encuentro skipped that part, built the punishment without the pretense of rehabilitation, built the cage without the programs. Ecuador's prison crisis predates El Encuentro. The country experienced waves of prison massacres starting in 2021. Rival gangs fought for control of facilities, beheadings, dismemberments, bodies thrown over walls, riots that left dozens dead. The violence was so extreme that the government declared states of emergency, deployed military forces into prisons, and eventually decided the only solution was to build CECOT-style isolation facilities. There were at least 119 documented violent deaths in Ecuador's prisons in 2025. Both 2024 and 2025 saw more intentional killings behind bars than 2023. Militarizing the prison system did not stop violence. Soldiers with rifles standing outside cell blocks didn't prevent inmates from killing each other inside. So the government moved to Plan B. Isolation so extreme that inmates can't organize, can't communicate, can't coordinate the kind of gang activity that drove the massacres. El Encuentro is that Plan B: extreme isolation as violence prevention. But isolation creates its own pathologies. Humans aren't wired for 23-hour-a-day confinement in small spaces. Mental health deteriorates, depression sets in, anxiety becomes constant. Some inmates break psychologically. Others become violent not because of gang affiliation, but because the pressure of confinement with 3 other men in a tiny cell for months creates unbearable stress. The government presents El Encuentro as a success. Fewer riots, fewer deaths, better control. And those things might be true in the short term. But control isn't the same as safety, and safety isn't the same as justice. You can stop violence by separating everyone from everyone else, but you can't claim you fixed a system that requires that level of isolation to function. You don't have to go to Central America to find a newly built prison drawing serious alarm. Construction on Alabama's new Governor K. Ivey Correctional Complex, a 4,000-bed facility in Elmore County, has been delayed by several months, moving its completion date to October 2026. The state is spending a massive sum to build this mega prison, described as the most expensive prison ever built in the U.S. Over $1 billion for a single facility, in a state that ranks near the bottom nationally in education funding, healthcare access, and infrastructure quality. Think about what $1 billion could build: schools, hospitals, roads, mental health facilities, substance abuse treatment centers. But Alabama chose concrete and razor wire instead. 4,000 beds in a state where the existing prison system is already under federal investigation for constitutional violations so severe that the Department of Justice sued the state twice. The mortality rate in Alabama prisons is 5 times the national average. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 5 times. That's not a marginal difference. That's a systematic failure so profound that an Alabama inmate is 5 times more likely to die in custody than an inmate in the average U.S. prison. Since 2019, more than 105 people have died from homicide in Alabama prisons, and at least 49 people have died from suicide. That's the system this billion-dollar building is supposed to fix. 105 murders, 49 suicides in just 6 years. Those numbers don't include deaths from medical neglect, overdose, or what gets classified as natural causes in a system, where natural can mean dying from a treatable illness because nobody treated it. Add those deaths and the toll climbs higher. Alabama's prisons don't just fail to protect inmates, they actively endanger them. Federal prosecutors have made clear that new facilities alone will not resolve the contributing factors to the overall unconstitutional condition of ADOC prisons, such as understaffing, culture, management deficiencies, corruption, policies, training, non-existent investigations, violence, illicit drugs, and sexual abuse. Read that list again: understaffing, corruption, non-existent investigations, sexual abuse. Those aren't problems and new building fixes. You can't construct your way out of a culture that tolerates guards raping inmates, smuggling drugs, and ignoring murders. Despite being put on notice 4 years ago that the U.S. Department of Justice was investigating the entire prison system for men, conditions only deteriorated. The DOJ sent investigators, documented violations, issued warnings, gave Alabama time to reform, and instead of improving, the system got worse. More deaths, more violence, more failures of basic security and medical care. So the DOJ did something extraordinary: they sued. Made Alabama the only state in the nation that faced 2 system-wide lawsuits from the federal government over unconstitutional prison conditions. 2 lawsuits, one for men's prisons, one for women's prisons, both documenting constitutional violations so egregious they required federal intervention. And Alabama's response: build a bigger prison. Families, former inmates, and former corrections staff packed a State House committee room in March 2026 to describe what they called ongoing violence, extortion, and unsafe, overcrowded conditions. These weren't activists or outsiders. These were people who lived inside the system, worked there, were incarcerated there, had family members locked up there. They came to the state legislature and testified that nothing had changed. That despite the federal lawsuits, despite the headlines, despite the promises, Alabama's prisons remained violent, corrupt, and deadly. Former corrections officer Stacey George said some inmates were subjected to what he described as a tune-up. Tune-up means if they don't do right and act right for whatever reason, they beat them up. That's a corrections officer testifying to state legislators that guards routinely beat inmates. Not defending himself, not claiming it was justified, just stating it as fact. This is what happens: guards beat prisoners. We call it a tune-up, everybody knows. So many prisoners are assaulted, stabbed, and killed that the Department of Corrections cannot keep track of the deaths. Cannot keep track in what is supposed to be a controlled, managed, state-run facility. People die and the state loses count. That's not bureaucratic inefficiency. That's institutional collapse. When you can't even maintain accurate death records, you've lost control of the most basic function of incarceration, keeping the people in your custody alive. The new prison opening in October 2026 will have modern security systems, better sight lines, improved cell design. All the architectural features that are supposed to make facilities safer. But architecture doesn't fix corruption. Design doesn't stop guards from beating inmates or smuggling drugs or turning a blind eye to violence. The same corrections officers who worked in the old prisons will staff the new one. The same culture that produced 5 times the national mortality rate will transfer to the new facility. Just newer buildings, same people, same problems. Alabama argues the new prison will allow them to close older, more dangerous facilities. Spread out the population, reduce overcrowding, and maybe that's true. But El Salvador also built new facilities and paired them with mass arrests that filled them beyond capacity within months. Ecuador built new facilities and opened them before construction finished because political pressure demanded visible action. New prisons don't guarantee better conditions. Sometimes they just provide more space to warehouse more people in a system that was already broken. While Alabama builds new, the federal government already operates what many consider the most restrictive prison in the United States. ADX Florence in Colorado, officially the United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility, opened in 1994 and houses roughly 340 of the most dangerous offenders in the federal system. This isn't a new facility, it's been operating for over 3 decades. But it represents the apex of American prison security, the model other countries study when designing supermax facilities, and the standard against which places like CECOT and El Encuentro are measured. Inmates at ADX spend 23 hours a day in soundproof cells measuring 7 by 12 feet, 84 square feet. For comparison, CECOT's 0.6 square meters per prisoner equals about 6.5 square feet. ADX inmates have roughly 13 times more space, and it's still psychological torture. The beds are poured concrete, the desk is poured concrete, the stool is poured concrete. Everything is designed so nothing can be picked up, weaponized, or used for self-harm. No loose objects, no sharp edges, nothing movable except your body and the clothes you're wearing. Windows are 4 inches wide, positioned so inmates can't see anything but sky. No view of the mountains visible from outside the prison. No view of other buildings. No view of trees or roads or anything that suggests a world beyond the cell. Just a thin slice of sky that tells you whether it's day or night, whether it's cloudy or clear. Whether seasons are changing. That's the extent of your connection to the outside world, 4 inches of sky. Meals are delivered through slots. Showers are taken alone 3 times a week in individual stalls. The 1 hour of exercise happens in a cage barely larger than the cell itself, with walls so high you can't see over them. Some exercise cages are outdoors, others are indoor rooms with high ceilings, but all share the same quality, total isolation. You're never in a space with another human being unless guards are moving you. And even then you're shackled, escorted, and returned to solitary the moment the movement is complete. Human contact is virtually non-existent. Guards communicate through intercoms. Other inmates are voices through vents, nothing more. You might hear someone yelling, singing, crying, banging on walls. But you never see them, never touch them, never have a conversation face to face. Years can pass without physical contact, with another human being beyond the hands of guards putting you in restraints. Former Warden Robert Hood, who ran ADX for several years, later said he believes the facility violates the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Think about that, the man who ran the place thinks it crosses the line. Not an activist, not an inmate advocate, the warden, the person responsible for security and operations. He retired and publicly stated that what happens at ADX, what he oversaw happening, violates the Constitution. That's a stunning admission, and the facility keeps operating anyway. Amnesty International has called conditions at ADX inhumane, noting the psychological damage of years, sometimes decades, in near-total isolation. Multiple lawsuits have challenged the facility's practices. Courts have occasionally ordered changes, better mental health care, some restrictions on how long mentally ill inmates can be held in isolation. But the basic model remains: solitary confinement, minimal contact, 23 hours a day in a concrete box. Inmates include terrorists, cartel leaders, and spies. Terry Nichols, who helped bomb the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker from the September 11 attacks. Ramzi Youssef, who bombed the World Trade Center in 1993. These are men whose crimes killed hundreds of people. Men whose presence in a regular prison would create security nightmares. Men who, if given any opportunity, might organize attacks from inside. But ADX also includes men who committed their worst offenses inside other prisons, assaulting guards, killing inmates, and were transferred to the Supermax as punishment. Men whose original crimes were drug trafficking or robbery, but who proved so violent or disruptive in prison that authorities decided permanent isolation was the only option. Some have been there since the facility opened in the 1990s. 30 years in a concrete box, 30 years hearing your own voice and almost no one else's, 30 years of a 4-inch window and a sky you can't reach. Mental health professionals who have studied isolation say the human brain isn't wired for it. We're social animals, we evolved in groups. Our brains develop structures specifically for processing social information, reading faces, interpreting tone of voice, understanding body language. Cut off human contact long enough and those structures start to misfire. The brain searches for social input that isn't there and starts generating it internally. That's when hallucinations begin. Paranoia follows. Without social interaction to reality test your thoughts, your mind spirals into suspicious patterns. Everyone's conspiring against you. The guards are plotting to kill you. The government is listening to your thoughts through the vents. These aren't metaphors. These are actual symptoms inmates develop after years in isolation. Delusions become reality because there's nothing to contradict them. Anxiety that turns into full-blown panic disorders. Depression that turns suicidal. ADX has had inmates smear feces on walls, mutilate themselves, and spend hours screaming at nothing. Guards watch through cameras but rarely intervene unless the inmate is actively dying. Screaming isn't a medical emergency. Self-harm up to a certain point isn't grounds for intervention. You have to cross a threshold, usually involving significant blood loss or loss of consciousness, before anyone responds. And when they're finally released, some do get out, sentences eventually end. They're released directly from ADX into society. No transition, no halfway house, no gradual reintroduction to human interaction. One day you're in a concrete box where you haven't had a normal conversation in 20 years. The next day you're on a bus to wherever you came from. 20 years of isolation, then suddenly you're supposed to function in the world again. The recidivism rate for ADX releases isn't publicly tracked, but mental health experts who have worked with former Supermax inmates describe profound difficulty with reintegration. Simple tasks become overwhelming. Being in a room with multiple people triggers panic. Normal social interaction feels threatening. Eye contact becomes unbearable. These are men whose brains have been fundamentally altered by years of isolation, then expected to navigate a world they can barely process. ADX represents American prison philosophy at its most extreme: total control through total isolation. And it's influenced facility design worldwide. When other countries build Supermax prisons, they study ADX, copy its architecture, adopt its protocols. The model spreads, not because it rehabilitates anyone, it doesn't. Not because it makes society safer, unclear at best, but because it offers perfect control. And in prison policy, control often trumps every other consideration. Russia calls it Pedak Island, but inmates call it something else: White Swan. The name sounds almost gentle until you learn what it means. The facility sits in the middle of a frozen lake in north-central Russia, surrounded by miles of ice and forest, about 500 miles east of Moscow. Escape is impossible, not because of walls, though there are walls, not because of guards, though there are guards, because of geography. Because the prison sits on an island in a region where winter lasts 8 months and temperatures regularly drop to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Try to escape and you're dead before you reach the shore. Freeze to death in water that will stop your heart within minutes. Make it to shore and you're dead within hours, lost in thousands of square miles of forest with no roads, no towns, no shelter. The environment itself is the security system. The prison doesn't need sophisticated surveillance or high walls because nature does the work. White Swan holds roughly 200 inmates in conditions designed to break the human spirit. Cells are 6 feet by 8 feet, 48 square feet. Better than CECOT's 6.5 square meters per person. Worse than ADX's 84. Inmates spend up to 22 hours a day inside them. In winter, temperatures inside the cells drop below freezing. No heating. No warm clothing beyond what inmates are issued. Thin uniforms designed for regulation compliance, not cold weather survival. Frostbite is common, fingers turn black, toes fall off. Ears get damaged by cold so severe that tissue dies. So is hypothermia, not the acute kind that kills you quickly, but chronic low-level hypothermia, where your core temperature drops a few degrees and stays there for months. Your body burns extra calories trying to stay warm. Metabolism increases, but food intake doesn't. So you're burning energy you don't have, getting weaker. More susceptible to illness, more likely to die from infections your body can't fight off. Food is minimal, usually bread, thin soup, and occasionally spoiled fish. Calories barely sufficient for survival in moderate climates. Completely inadequate for extreme cold. Inmates lose weight continuously. Not weight loss from diet or exercise, weight loss from starvation. Faces become gaunt, ribs visible, limbs withered. Bodies consuming themselves trying to generate heat. Medical care is nearly non-existent. Inmates with tuberculosis, the facility has one of the highest TB rates. In the Russian prison system, are often left untreated. TB in cold environments spreads faster because everyone stays indoors, packed together breathing recycled air. The disease moves through cell blocks like wildfire. Coughing that starts with one inmate spreads to his cellmate, then the cell next door, then the tier, then the building. And nobody receives treatment until they're coughing blood, if then. The disease spreads through the ventilation system, infecting cell after cell, block after block. Russia's prison TB strains are often drug-resistant because the medical system uses outdated medication or fails to complete treatment courses properly. You get sick with a strain that doesn't respond to standard drugs. The prison can't or won't provide advanced treatment. So you waste away coughing, feverish, infecting everyone around you until your lungs fail. Violence is constant, murders happen, rapes happen, beatings happen. Guards rarely intervene unless the situation threatens to spiral beyond a single victim. White Swan operates on a strict hierarchy brought over from Soviet-era prison camps. Political prisoners at the top, there are few now, but the structure remains. Thieves and organized crime in the middle. Sex offenders and informants at the bottom, subject to constant abuse. The hierarchy isn't just social. It's enforced through violence so systematic it might as well be policy. Bottom-tier inmates clean toilets, handle garbage, do the worst work. They eat last after food has been picked through by higher-status prisoners. They sleep in the worst spots, near toilets, near doors where cold air seeps in. And they endure regular beatings just for existing in their designated category. Guards know this happens, participate in it sometimes. Use the inmate hierarchy to maintain control. Need someone punished, tell the right prisoner. He'll spread the word, the beating happens, and guards never officially knew anything about it. Plausible deniability built into the structure. What makes White Swan particularly brutal is the psychology of isolation combined with extreme cold. You're not just locked up, you're locked up in a place where the environment itself is hostile, where winter lasts 8 months, where the sun barely rises above the horizon for weeks at a time, where cold seeps into your bones and stays there, and you know that even if you somehow got outside the walls, you'd freeze to death before reaching civilization. The darkness compounds the cold. In deepest winter, daylight lasts maybe 4 or 5 hours. The rest is darkness, not twilight, full darkness. No streetlights, no city glow on the horizon, just dark. And in those conditions, in cells with minimal heating, with inadequate food, with untreated illness, the mind starts to break down. Former inmates describe White Swan as a place where hope dies faster than people do. where the cold numbs you physically and the isolation numbs you mentally until you stop feeling anything at all. Where time stops meaning anything because every day is the same. Cold, hungry, alone, and waiting for something to kill you before the environment does. Some wait for violence, others for disease, many for the cold itself to finish what it started. Russia has dozens of prisons worse than what most countries would consider humane. White Swan isn't even the harshest, but it represents something particular. Geographical isolation as punishment. You can't escape not because security is perfect, but because nature itself has sentenced you to this island. The lake freezes, the forest swallows, and you remain cold and forgotten until you die or your sentence ends, whichever comes first. Diyarbakir prison in southeastern Turkey gained international infamy in the 1980s and 1990s as one of the most brutal detention facilities in the world. Though officially closed and converted to a cultural center in recent years, its legacy remains as a testament to systematic state torture. What happened inside those walls during its operational decades has been documented by human rights organizations, former inmates, and even some guards who later spoke out. And what emerges is a picture of intentional, systematic brutality implemented as state policy. During its operational years, Diyarbakir held primarily Kurdish political prisoners. Activists, suspected militants, journalists, and intellectuals accused of opposing the Turkish state. Turkey's conflict with Kurdish separatist movements drove mass arrests throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Thousands were detained, many disappeared. Others reappeared in places like Diyarbakir, changed by what happened there, in ways they never fully recovered from. Torture was routine, not exceptional, not reserved for specific cases. Routine. Beatings with clubs, cables, rifle butts. Electric shocks applied to genitals, fingers, ears. Stress positions hanging by wrists, forced standing for days. Confinement in boxes too small to sit or stand in. Sleep deprivation extending for weeks. Bright lights, constant noise. Sensory overload designed to break prisoners mentally when physical torture didn't work fast enough. Inmates were hung by their wrists for days. Arms pulled behind backs at angles that dislocated shoulders. Circulation cut off until hands turned purple. Fed starvation rations. Maybe one meal a day of thin soup and bread. Denied medical care for injuries inflicted during interrogation. Bones broken during beatings went unset. Infections from electrical burns went untreated. Prisoners watched their own bodies deteriorate and received no help. Sexual violence was widespread. Guards raped prisoners, men and women both, as a form of humiliation and control. Rape in prison serves multiple purposes from the torturer's perspective. Physical pain, psychological destruction. Social stigma that isolates victims even after release because of cultural shame around sexual violence. Inmates were forced to perform sexual acts on each other while guards watched. Guards raped prisoners with batons, bottles, other objects. The goal was complete dehumanization. The psychological damage from this kind of systematic degradation lasted long after physical wounds healed. Former inmates described decades of trauma. Nightmares, flashbacks, inability to form relationships, constant hypervigilance. Panic attacks triggered by reminders of imprisonment. This isn't just anecdotal. Medical professionals who have treated torture survivors document consistent patterns of long-term psychological damage that often proves more debilitating than physical injuries. Children as young as 12 were held at Diyarbakir. Juveniles accused of throwing stones at soldiers or participating in protests found themselves locked in cells with hardened militants, subjected to the same torture techniques used on adults. 12-year-olds beaten with cables, teenagers subjected to electric shock. Children hung from walls. The Turkish state made no distinction based on age. Political opposition was political opposition, regardless of the age of the person expressing it. Some died under torture. Others emerged so damaged psychologically that they never fully recovered. Child victims of state torture often develop particularly severe psychological problems because their brains were still developing when trauma occurred. Personality structures fracture, ability to trust gets destroyed. Many former child prisoners from Diyarbakir spent their adult lives dealing with psychiatric conditions directly traceable to what the Turkish state did to them as children. The death toll at Diyarbakir was never fully documented because the Turkish government classified much of what happened there Conservative estimates put the number of prisoners who died from torture, medical neglect, or suicide in the hundreds. Some human rights groups believe the true number is higher, possibly over 1,000 across the facility's most brutal decades. Bodies were released to families with explanations like suicide or heart attack, or complications from prior health conditions. Families who tried to investigate were threatened into silence. What made Diyarbakir particularly horrifying was that it operated with full state knowledge and approval. This wasn't rogue guards acting on their own. This was institutional policy. Torture manuals existed, documents instructing security forces on interrogation techniques, how much pain to apply, how to avoid leaving visible marks. Interrogation techniques were taught in formal training programs. Guards were trained in how to inflict maximum pain without leaving marks that would be visible to inspectors. Senior officials knew, approved, visited the facility. The torture happened not despite government oversight, but because of it. This was the system working as designed. The state identified enemies, Kurdish activists, separatists, intellectuals, and implemented a systematic program to destroy them physically and psychologically. Diyarbakir was one tool in that program. Even after international pressure forced Turkey to close the facility and convert it into a museum and cultural center, the ghosts remain. Survivors still carry the scars, physical and psychological. Families still don't know exactly how their loved ones died. Mass graves have never been fully excavated, and the Turkish government has never fully acknowledged the scope of what happened there. Some officials admit excesses occurred, but systematic torture, state policy, that they won't acknowledge. The museum, now operating at the former prison site, presents a sanitized version of history. Yes, it says unfortunate things happened here, but the exhibits don't capture the reality. Can't convey the screams that echoed through those cells. Can't recreate the smell of blood and fear and unwashed bodies that damaged developing lungs. 10-year-olds operating machinery with no safety guards. Childhood didn't exist at Camp 22. You worked or you died, sometimes both. Food was survival rations, corn and cabbage soup, sometimes with rats or insects added when prisoners could catch them. Corn soup made from corn stalks, not kernels. Cabbage rotted and still boiled into soup because it was calories. Malnutrition was universal, starvation was common. Inmates ate grass, tree bark, anything remotely digestible. Defectors describe eating undigested corn kernels picked from animal feces, because it contained calories their bodies desperately needed. Former guards who defected described watching prisoners die from eating toxic plants, because they were so desperate for food. Inmates would see something green, something that looked like it might be edible, and they'd eat it despite knowing it might be poisonous because the alternative was definitely starvation. Some survived, others died vomiting, seizing, bleeding from internal damage caused by plant toxins. Guards watched and did nothing. Less prisoners meant fewer mouths to feed. Public executions happened regularly. Prisoners were forced to watch as inmates accused of stealing food or attempting escape were shot, hanged, or beaten to death. Children watched their parents executed. Parents watched their children executed. The executions served both punishment and deterrent. Step out of line, and this is what happens. We'll kill you in front of everyone. We'll make your family watch. Sometimes the executed had committed the alleged offense. Often they hadn't. Confessions were beaten out of prisoners who'd never done what they were accused of, but confessed anyway to make the torture stop. Then they were executed for the confession. The truth didn't matter, only control mattered. Medical experimentation occurred at Camp 22, according to testimony from former guards. Chemical weapons tested on prisoners locked in glass chambers. New drugs tested without consent or explanation. Procedures performed without anesthesia, vivisections, amputations, organ removal. Women forcibly sterilized. Pregnant women forced to abort or watching their newborns killed because new prisoners represented future mouths to feed. One defector who'd worked as a guard described gas chamber testing, where families were locked inside sealed rooms and exposed to chemical agents. Guards watched through observation windows as prisoners died, timed how long it took, noted symptoms, documented effects, then removed the bodies and brought in the next group. Human experimentation conducted as casually as testing agricultural chemicals on insects. Satellite imagery from the early 2000s showed the camp's massive footprint. 50 square kilometers of barbed wire, guard towers, and buildings. Then in 2012, the images changed. The camp appeared to be closing or consolidating. Buildings demolished, fence lines removed, the facility's footprint shrinking. Analysts believe prisoners were transferred to other facilities or simply killed. North Korea has never acknowledged Camp 22's existence, let alone explained what happened to the tens of thousands of people held there. Did they transfer 50,000 prisoners to other camps? That's a logistical nightmare. More likely, they killed most of them. Mass graves somewhere in those forests. Bodies buried in mine shafts, evidence destroyed. And the world will probably never know because North Korea doesn't answer questions about its prison camps. And nobody can force them to. Camp 22 represents the extreme end of political incarceration. Not prisoners who committed crimes, not even prisoners who genuinely opposed the government. Just people who were accused or related to people who were accused, locked away for life with their children and grandchildren to work until they died. 3-generation punishment, inherited guilt, concentration camps operating in the 21st century. And the world knew and did nothing because North Korea has nuclear weapons. And China props up the regime and economic sanctions. Don't open prison camps. Tadmor Prison, also called Palmyra Prison, sits in the Syrian desert, near the ancient ruins that gave the region its name. The facility opened in the 1930s under French colonial rule, but its worst years came under the Assad regime, particularly in the 1980s. Desert prisons carry their own particular horror: extreme heat, no shade, water scarcity, and in Tadmor's case, systematic torture and massacre that killed thousands. On June 27, 1980, members of Syria's defense companies stormed the prison in response to an assassination attempt on President Hafez al-Assad. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood had attempted to kill Assad. He survived, and he ordered retaliation, not against the assassins specifically, against prisoners in Tadmor, many of whom had nothing to do with the assassination attempt. Collective punishment, political prisoners, Islamists, dissidents, all targeted for what one group tried to do. What followed was one of the worst massacres in modern prison history. Guards entered cell blocks with machine guns, grenades, and axes. They killed everyone they could find. Inmates had no weapons, no defense. Nowhere to run. Desert prison, miles from anywhere. Surrounded by guards with automatic weapons. They died in their cells, in corridors, in exercise yards. Shot, hacked, blown apart by grenades thrown into crowded spaces. Estimates of the dead range from 500 to 1,000, killed in a matter of hours. Syrian authorities never released official numbers. Families were never told. Bodies were never returned. Survivors kept silent for decades out of fear. Some details only emerged years later when the Assad regime finally collapsed and former prisoners felt safe enough to speak. After the massacre, Tadmor became a place where political prisoners, particularly Islamists opposed to the Assad government, were sent to disappear. Families might know their relative was arrested. They usually didn't know where he was taken. Tadmor operated in a legal black hole, no access to lawyers, no communication with families, no oversight, just disappearance into the desert. Amnesty International documented systematic torture. Beatings with cables and wooden planks that broke bones, ruptured organs, left permanent scars. Electric shocks applied to genitals, nipples, tongues. A torture device called the German chair that bent prisoners' spines backward until vertebrae fractured. Victims strapped into a metal chair, body folded backward at impossible angles, held there for hours. Some walked again, many didn't. Spinal damage from the German chair often left prisoners paralyzed or in permanent pain. A wooden press called the wheel that crushed limbs. Prisoner's arm or leg inserted into a wooden frame, pressure applied slowly until bones splintered. Screaming did nothing, begging did nothing. Guards operated the wheel until they got bored or got information, or the prisoner passed out. Often the prisoner's answer hadn't changed. He didn't have information to give. Wasn't part of any plot, was innocent of the charges. Didn't matter, they crushed his limbs anyway. Cells at Tadmor held up to 50 men in spaces designed for 10. 500 square feet packed with 50 human beings, 10 square feet per person. Barely room to lie down. No ventilation in a desert where summer temperatures exceed 110 degrees. Inmates stood pressed against each other, unable to sit or lie down for days. Some died standing up, held upright by the crush of bodies. Others died from heat stroke, dehydration, heart failure brought on by extreme temperatures in enclosed spaces. Former inmates described being denied water in a desert prison. Guards would withhold water for days as punishment. Prisoners begged, fainted, hallucinated. Some died of dehydration despite being locked in a building that presumably had running water. Guards just chose not to provide it. Thirst kills slower than a bullet, but just as certainly, and it's cheaper. No ammunition required, just cruelty. Denied food for days, a meal every third or fourth day. just enough to keep prisoners from dying too quickly, but not enough to maintain health. Weight loss, muscle wasting, immune systems collapsing. Men who entered Tadmor healthy emerged skeletal, if they emerged at all. Denied medical care for injuries inflicted during torture. One survivor recounted watching a fellow prisoner's leg turn gangrenous from an untreated infection, the smell filling the cell until the man finally died after weeks of agony. Gangrene has a particular smell, sweet, rotting, unmistakable. And in packed cells with no ventilation, that smell concentrated. Everyone breathed it. Everyone knew another inmate was dying, and everyone knew they'd be next if they got injured or sick. The Syrian government closed Tadmor in 2001 under international pressure. Amnesty International had been documenting abuses for years. Reports accumulated. International bodies issued condemnations. Syria, seeking better relations with Western countries, made concessions. Closing Tadmor was one, but closing a prison doesn't undo what happened there. Doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't heal the survivors. Just removes one location from the roster of active torture sites. ISIS briefly held the facility during Syria's civil war and executed prisoners there. The Islamic State captured Palmyra in 2015, found the prison, used it the way everyone uses it, to imprison and kill enemies. They executed prisoners in the same exercise yards where the Assad regime executed prisoners decades earlier. Different ideology, same methods, same result, same blood soaking into the same dirt. The Assad regime recaptured the prison in 2016, and reports suggest it may be operational again, though information is difficult to verify in the chaos of Syria's ongoing conflict. Syria denies it, human rights groups suspect otherwise. Satellite imagery is inconclusive. Refugees who have fled recently sometimes mention Tadmor, sometimes don't. The truth is probably that some version of Tadmor is operating. Maybe not the full facility, but detention and torture continuing in that location, because the infrastructure exists and nobody's been held accountable for what happened there before. Tadmor represents what happens when a regime decides it can do whatever it wants to prisoners, and nobody will stop it. Assad was right, nobody stopped it. The massacre happened, the torture continued. The international community issued statements and sanctions and accomplished nothing. Tadmor operated for decades, closed briefly, probably reopened. And the Syrian state has never faced meaningful consequences. Bangkok's Bang Kwang Central Prison, nicknamed Big Tiger, holds roughly 8,000 inmates in a facility designed for half that number. But it's not the overcrowding that makes Bang Kwang notorious. It's what happens to inmates on death row. Thailand still uses execution by lethal injection, carried out at Bang Kwang. And the conditions for prisoners awaiting execution combine medieval practices with modern cruelty. Prisoners on death row are shackled 24 hours a day. Heavy leg irons weighing 10 to 15 pounds are welded onto their ankles. The irons never come off, not for sleep, not for showers, not for anything. Prisoners shuffle everywhere they go, the weight of the shackles tearing skin, causing infections, destroying ankle joints over months and years. The constant pressure creates open sores. The metal rubs the same spots raw, skin breaks down, infections develop. And the shackles never come off, so the wounds never heal. Imagine carrying 15 pounds of metal attached to your legs. Walking requires effort, stairs become obstacles. Getting up from a bed or toilet requires planning. The weight is constant. 15 pounds doesn't sound like much until you carry it every second of every day. Your muscles fatigue, your gait changes, your spine adjusts to compensate for the imbalance. Over years, your body breaks down from the unnatural stress. Death row inmates don't know when they'll be executed. There's no schedule, no advance notice. Guards simply arrive at a cell early one morning, unlock the door, and take the prisoner to the execution chamber. No warning, no chance to prepare, no goodbye to family. One moment you're in your cell, an hour later you're dead. That's how Thailand executes people. Surprise executions designed to minimize resistance and unrest. Prisoners can't organize final visits or appeals or protests if they don't know it's their last day. Foreign prisoners have described Bang Kwang as medieval. Cells are tiny, filthy, infested with rats and cockroaches. Rats that have evolved to live in prisons, feeding on food scraps and whatever else they can find. Cockroaches so numerous they cover walls at night, insects crawling over sleeping prisoners. You wake up with bugs on your face, in your clothes, everywhere. And there's nothing you can do. Insecticide isn't provided. Cells can't be properly cleaned, the bugs own the place. The heat is oppressive. Bangkok's tropical climate means temperatures inside cells regularly exceed 100 degrees with no air conditioning. Concrete buildings under tropical sun, no ventilation, body heat from packed inmates. Temperatures hit 100, 105, 110 degrees inside. Humidity adds to the suffering. Sweat doesn't evaporate in humid heat, it just soaks you. Everything's damp: clothes, bedding, skin, and the heat never stops. Day and night, month after month, year after year. Water is scarce. Prisons aren't air-conditioned, but also aren't designed with heat in mind. Water shortages happen frequently. Inmates get limited water for drinking, washing, toilets. Dehydration is common. Prisoners beg for extra water, sometimes get it, often don't. Guards control water access, which gives them leverage. Want something from an inmate, deny water until he complies. Want to punish someone, cut his water ration. Survival needs become control mechanisms. Food is minimal, usually rice, sometimes with vegetables, rarely with meat. Thailand's prison food is inadequate in both quantity and nutrition. Rice provides calories but lacks nutrients. Vegetables are often rotted or spoiled before they reach inmates. Meat is almost non-existent, except for occasional small portions of fish or chicken too poor quality to sell in markets. Malnutrition is widespread. Vitamin deficiencies cause health problems that go untreated. Medical care is virtually non-existent. Inmates with serious illnesses, cancer, heart disease, AIDS, often go untreated. Thailand's HIV/AIDS rates in prison are high, partly because of drug use, partly because of sexual violence, partly because medical care doesn't address prevention or treatment. Tuberculosis spreads through overcrowded blocks. Dengue fever outbreaks happen during rainy season. When mosquitoes breed in standing water, prisoners die from preventable diseases. Because the prison hospital is understaffed, undersupplied, and overwhelmed. Violence is endemic: gang-related stabbings, beatings over territory, resources, or personal conflicts. Rapes both by other inmates and sometimes by guards. Guards are outnumbered and often turn a blind eye to inmate-on-inmate violence, as long as it doesn't escalate to full riots. Better to let prisoners police themselves than intervene and risk getting hurt. So violence continues. The strong prey on the weak. Gang members extort and assault. And guards do nothing unless it threatens institutional control. Foreigners are particularly vulnerable. They don't speak Thai, don't understand the prison's social hierarchy, don't have family connections to send money for bribes or protection. Western inmates often get targeted because other prisoners assume they have wealthy families who will send money. They get extorted, beaten if they don't pay, sometimes killed if the amount demanded is high enough and the foreigner can't produce it. One British inmate who spent years at Bang Kwang described the psychological torture of the death penalty: shackles, the constant weight, the skin rubbed raw, the infections that never quite heal because the metal keeps cutting into the same wounds, the knowledge that every morning might be your last, that guards might arrive at your cell and drag you to your execution with no warning. That psychological state, permanent uncertainty about when you'll die, creates sustained trauma different from but possibly worse than knowing your execution date. At least with a date you can prepare. At Bang Kwang, you wake up every morning wondering if this is the day. That uncertainty destroys mental health even in inmates who eventually get their sentences commuted. Bang Kwang represents a particular kind of prison cruelty, combining overcrowding, heat, violence, and arbitrary death sentences into one facility. It's not the deadliest prison discussed here, not the most violent, but it's among the most psychologically destructive because it keeps inmates in perpetual uncertainty while subjecting them to daily suffering from heat, hunger, violence, and disease. You don't know if you'll be executed tomorrow or live for decades. You just know you'll suffer either way. La Sabaneta prison in Maracaibo, Venezuela, operated for decades as one of the most violent detention facilities in the Western Hemisphere. The facility was designed to hold 15,000 inmates, but routinely held over 20,000. Overcrowding created conditions where the Venezuelan government effectively lost control of the prison to inmate gangs. Not lost control temporarily during a riot, lost control for years. Inmates ran the facility. Guards stayed in administrative offices. The prison became a city-state run by gangs. Inmates ran La Sabaneta, not guards, not administrators, inmates. Gang leaders controlled entire cell blocks, collecting rent from other prisoners, deciding who lived and who died, running drug operations and extortion rackets that reached beyond the prison walls. Families outside paid protection money to gang leaders inside to keep relatives safe. Businesses outside paid gangs inside for influence with guards who were supposedly guarding prisoners, but were actually taking orders from them. Guards stayed in their offices or patrolled only in large groups, armed, knowing that entering certain blocks meant risking their lives. Cell blocks A through D were gang territory. E and F were contested zones. G was no man's land where the weakest prisoners tried to survive without gang protection. Guards didn't enter A through D without explicit permission from gang leaders. They'd knock on the block entrance. Wait for approval, enter with deference, leave as quickly as possible. Inside those blocks, gang leaders had more authority than prison administrators. Violence at La Sabineta was constant and extreme. On January 2, 1994, one of the worst prison riots in Latin American history erupted. Inmates armed with knives, machetes, and improvised weapons attacked each other. In a power struggle between rival gangs, not guards versus inmates, inmates versus inmates. Two major gangs fighting for control of the prison. The riot wasn't about conditions or treatment. It was a gang war that happened to take place inside a prison. The riot lasted 10 days, 10 days of sustained combat. Guards sealed the facility and let the inmates fight it out. No intervention. No attempt to separate combatants, just locked the gates and waited for one side to win. When it ended, 108 inmates were dead and more than 200 were injured. Bodies piled in corridors, blood in inches-deep pools, survivors hiding in cells praying not to be found. And when it finally stopped, guards entered to remove corpses and treat wounded. Then they left again and the gangs resumed control. But that wasn't the worst of it. Another riot in 1995 killed over 200 prisoners. Weapons used included guns, firearms somehow smuggled into a maximum security prison that inmates used to massacre rivals, not improvised weapons, actual guns, pistols, rifles, shotguns. Ammunition stockpiled. Gang members formed firing lines and executed rivals systematically. Bodies were piled in courtyards. The stench was so overwhelming that guards refused to enter to recover corpses for days. Bodies rotted in tropical heat. Bloated burst, the smell carried for miles. Between riots, the day-to-day violence continued. Stabbings over territorial disputes, debts, insults. Beheadings as warnings to rival gangs or prisoners who didn't pay rent. Inmates hanged from railings to display power. Bodies thrown from upper tiers onto concrete below. The strong preyed on the weak. Gang members raped and killed with impunity. And guards did nothing because they couldn't. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and terrified. Healthcare at La Sabineta was non-existent. Inmates injured in fights bled out, because no medical staff would enter the blocks. Diseases spread unchecked, tuberculosis, HIV, hepatitis spreading through shared needles. Unprotected sex and lack of sanitation. One former prisoner described seeing a man die from a simple infection. Because there were no antibiotics, another watched a stabbing victim bleed to death over several hours while other inmates stepped over the body, going about their business because death was so common it didn't warrant attention. Sanitation failed completely, toilets backed up and overflowed, sewage pooled in corridors. Inmates lived in filth, garbage piled up because removal crews refused to enter dangerous blocks. The smell was indescribable, human waste, rotting garbage, decomposing bodies, all mixing in tropical heat. Diseases that should have been eradicated in the 20th century flourished at La Sabineta. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. Inmates died from sanitation-related diseases that are easily preventable in functioning societies. The Venezuelan government eventually closed La Sabineta in 2013, but not before decades of carnage. Estimates of the total death toll, including riots, individual murders, and deaths from disease, and medical neglect run into the thousands. Exact numbers are unknown because the chaos inside was so complete that accurate records were never kept. Bodies were removed, sometimes families were notified, often they weren't. Prisoners disappeared and families never learned if they died in riots, murders, or disease. Just gone. Lost in the violence, Venezuela's prison crisis didn't end with La Sabineta's closure. The overcrowding moved to other facilities. The gangs moved to other prisons. The violence continued, only the location changed. Venezuelan prisons remain among the most dangerous in the world. Inmates still run facilities, guards still fear entering certain areas, and the death toll continues climbing. Because the underlying problems, overcrowding, corruption, lack of resources, failure of rule of law, were never addressed, closing La Sabineta was symbolic, it didn't fix anything. La Sabineta represents what happens when a state completely loses control of its prison system. When incarceration becomes warehousing in facilities so overcrowded and under-resourced. That control transfers to the strongest prisoners. When violence becomes routine and death becomes expected. When the authorities give up and the inmates establish their own governance. That's La Sabineta, that was La Sabineta, and that's still the reality in many Venezuelan prisons today. Gitarama Central Prison in Rwanda achieved infamy in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide, when the facility became a dumping ground for suspected perpetrators. The prison was designed to hold 600 inmates. By 1995, it held over 7,000. By some reports, the number peaked closer to 10,000. 10,000 human beings forced into a space designed for 600. The math makes the reality almost incomprehensible. Do the math, 600 capacity, 7,000 inmates, where do they fit? They don't, there's no room, no space, no air. Prisoners stood pressed together in open-air courtyards, in cells, in hallways, in every available space. They stood for days because there was no room to sit or lie down. The press of bodies was so tight that movement was impossible. You stood in whatever position you managed to find and stayed there until the mass of humanity shifted enough that you could adjust slightly. They stood until their legs gave out. Then they collapsed and were held upright by the press of bodies around them. Passing out didn't mean you fell down. You passed out standing up. Held in place by the prisoners packed around you. Some men died standing up. Heart attacks, strokes, organ failure, and their bodies remained upright for hours, sometimes days, because the crowd couldn't shift enough to let them fall. People stood next to corpses they didn't even know were corpses, because in the press and the chaos and the stench, one more person who'd stopped moving didn't register as unusual. Sanitation was non-existent. Toilets overflowed within hours. There weren't enough toilets for 600 people, let alone 7,000. Human waste filled the floors, then the courtyards, then everything. Prisoners stood in sewage, slept in sewage, ate in sewage. Feces and urine mixing with rainwater and mud to create a toxic soup that inmates couldn't escape because there was nowhere to escape to. The smell was so overpowering that guards refused to enter certain sections without masks. International observers who visited described having to vomit from the stench before they could continue their inspections. Disease spread like wildfire: dysentery, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. Inmates died daily from preventable illnesses because there was no medical care and no way to isolate the sick. Diseases that spread through contaminated water flourished when thousands of people stood in sewage. Diseases that spread through respiratory droplets flourished when people were packed so tightly. They breathed each other's exhalations. Bodies were left where they fell, because guards couldn't navigate through the packed masses to remove them. Corpses decomposed among the living for hours or days, until the press of humanity shifted enough that guards could drag the bodies out. Gangrene was epidemic. Prisoners standing in sewage developed infections on their feet and legs. Minor cuts turned septic. Without treatment, the infections turned gangrenous. Limbs rotted. The smell of rotting flesh added to the smell of sewage and death, and unwashed bodies packed together in tropical heat. Some inmates died from the infections: blood poisoning, septic shock. Others survived but lost feet, legs, toes, limbs that simply rotted off their bodies. Tissue died and detached. Men woke up to find parts of their feet had fallen off during the night. Dissolved by necrotic infection, food was scarce. The Rwandan government, still reeling from genocide, had little resources to spare for prison feeding. The international community provided some aid, but not enough. Rations were minimal. Sometimes just one meal a day of beans and cornmeal. 2,000 calories a day would be adequate for a sedentary person. These prisoners were getting maybe 1,000 calories, often less, while standing for most of their waking hours, burning energy trying to stay upright. Fighting infections, shivering through cold nights. Malnutrition was universal. Starvation was common. Inmates fought over scraps. The strong ate, the weak died. Some prisoners resorted to eating anything they could find: rats caught in cells, insects, grass growing in the exercise yard, tree bark, anything with calories. Human brains aren't wired to process watching themselves starve. The body consumes its own muscle tissue. Fat reserves disappear. Skin hangs loose on skeletal frames. Organs start to fail from lack of nutrients. And you watch it happening, feel yourself getting weaker, know you're dying, and there's nothing you can do because there's no food. International observers who visited Gitarama in the mid-1990s described it as one of the worst humanitarian disasters they'd ever witnessed. Red Cross officials who'd seen conflict zones across Africa said Gitarama exceeded anything in their experience. Thousands of people crammed into spaces meant for hundreds, standing in sewage, dying from disease, watching their own limbs rot off, and no end in sight because Rwanda's judicial system was so overwhelmed by genocide prosecutions that most inmates hadn't been charged, let alone tried. Some prisoners waited years for trial, some were innocent. Some were guilty of minor crimes that got swept up in the post-genocide chaos. Some were genocide perpetrators who deserved punishment, but not this. International law prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, even for the guilty. Even for murderers, even for genocidaires. But Gitarama exceeded any definition of humane detention. It was systematic torture through neglect, death by exposure to disease and starvation. Rwanda eventually built new facilities and reduced Gitarama's population. Trials moved forward, inmates were transferred. The worst overcrowding eased. But for the men who survived years at Gitarama in its worst state, the damage was permanent. Physical disabilities from lost limbs and chronic infections. Psychological trauma from years of standing in sewage watching people die. The survivors carry those scars for life. Gitarama represents what happens when a prison system completely collapses. When capacity is exceeded by 1,000%. When resources disappear. When disease runs unchecked. When the only goal becomes warehousing as many people as possible, regardless of consequences. It's an extreme case, but it's a reminder of how fast prisons can deteriorate when systems break down, and how much suffering can result when authorities either can't or won't maintain basic human standards. While Pedak Island is brutal because of geography and cold, Russia's Black Dolphin prison in Orenburg is brutal by design. The facility holds roughly 700 of Russia's most dangerous criminals. Serial killers, terrorists, cannibals, and men convicted of multiple murders. Once you enter Black Dolphin, you never leave. Life sentences with no parole, no hope, no future. Just decades in a system designed to erase your humanity one day at a time. Prisoners are blindfolded or made to walk bent at 90 degrees whenever they leave their cells. The reasoning is security, preventing inmates from memorizing layouts or planning escapes. But the effect is dehumanizing. You don't walk upright. You shuffle bent over, seeing only the floor in front of you. Guards stand behind you, hands on your shoulders, forcing you to maintain that position. Moving from cell to shower, bent over. Cell to exercise yard, bent over. Cell to visitation, bent over. Some prisoners spend years this way and develop permanent spinal damage. Vertebrae compress, discs herniate. Muscles adapt to the bent position and resist straightening. By the time a prisoner has been at Black Dolphin for a decade, standing fully upright becomes painful or impossible. The damage is permanent. They'll spend the rest of their lives with spinal problems, created by being forced to walk bent over hundreds of times. Cells are 50 square feet. Inmates spend 23 hours a day inside them. 2 or 3 men to a cell, a metal bed, a toilet, a tiny table, that's it. No books beyond what's approved, usually just religious texts. No television, no radio. No contact with the outside world beyond rare, heavily monitored visits from immediate family. Cameras watch everything, eating, sleeping, using the toilet. Privacy doesn't exist. Guards monitor screens showing every cell 24/7. They watch you sleep, watch you use the toilet, watch you eat, watch you exist. Every moment of your life is observed, recorded, archived. You're never alone, never unwatched. The psychological impact of total surveillance is profound. Paranoia develops even in inmates who enter psychologically healthy. You know you're being watched, always, never a moment of true privacy. Neither does darkness, lights stay on 24/7. Can't turn them off, can't dim them. Full fluorescent lighting all day, all night, forever. Sleep becomes difficult, circadian rhythms disrupt. The body doesn't know when it should be asleep or awake because light levels never change. Exhaustion becomes chronic. Sleep deprivation affects cognition, mood, physical health. But the lights stay on. Security justification is that guards need to see into cells at all times. Reality is that constant lighting becomes another form of torture. Neither does silence. Guards check on prisoners every 15 minutes. Banging on doors, making sure everyone is accounted for. Sleep is constantly interrupted. You drift off. Bang, bang, bang on the door. Guards checking, you wake up, they leave. You drift off again. 15 minutes later, bang, bang, bang. Years of sleep interruptions create sleep disorders that don't resolve even after release. Your brain learns to never enter deep sleep because interruption is coming. So you spend your life in light sleep stages, never fully resting, accumulating sleep debt that destroys health. The 1 hour of exercise happens in a cage measuring 10 feet by 6 feet. 60 square feet, just big enough to take a few steps. High walls block any view, sky overhead, nothing else. 1 hour to walk in circles, pace back and forth. Do push-ups or sit-ups if you're motivated. Then back to the cell for 23 more hours. That's your life, 23 hours in 50 square feet. 1 hour and 60 square feet every day for life. Food is minimal but better than some Russian prisons. Bread, soup, tea, occasionally meat. Caloric intake is adequate to prevent starvation but insufficient for health. Meals are delivered through slots. Human contact is virtually non-existent. Guards speak to prisoners only when necessary, commands, instructions, warnings. Inmates don't interact with each other except through ventilation ducts. Shouted conversations, messages passed through vents, but no face-to-face interaction. Years can pass without touching another human being, except when guards grab you to put you in restraints. Psychological damage is severe. Inmates develop extreme anxiety, depression, paranoia. Some hallucinate voices, visions. Sensory input is so limited that brains start generating their own. Some go catatonic, shut down mentally as a defense mechanism against unbearable conditions. Some mutilate themselves, cutting, burning, anything to feel something other than the crushing monotony. Suicide attempts are common, though the camera surveillance and frequent checks prevent most from succeeding. Guards arrive before blood loss kills. Inmates get medical attention just sufficient to keep them alive, then return to the same cell to endure more years of isolation. Former guards who have worked at Black Dolphin describe it as a tomb for the living. Men sent there know they'll die behind those walls. Decades will pass, they'll grow old, get sick, die, and they'll never walk upright, never see the horizon, never touch another person except in restraints. They'll spend 23 hours a day in 50 square feet being watched by cameras, and 1 hour a day in a cage that's not much bigger. That's their entire existence, from arrival until death. The men at Black Dolphin committed horrific crimes. Serial killers, mass murderers, cannibals who killed and ate victims. These aren't sympathetic prisoners. But even acknowledging their crimes, the conditions at Black Dolphin raise questions. Is this punishment or torture? Is there a line between the two? And if that line exists, does Black Dolphin cross it? The Russian government says no. Human rights organizations say yes. And the prisoners spend decades in 50 square foot cells, regardless of who's right. Kamiti Maximum Security Prison outside Nairobi holds roughly 3,000 inmates, in a facility designed for far fewer. But what distinguishes Kamiti is its death row, one of the largest in Africa, and the conditions prisoners face while waiting for executions that may never come. Kenya hasn't executed anyone since 1987. The death penalty remains on the books but isn't carried out. International pressure, shifting political winds, and Kenya's desire for better relations with Europe all contribute to the de facto moratorium. So prisoners sentenced to hang sit on death row for years, decades. Some have been there for over 30 years, waiting for an execution that international pressure and domestic politics make increasingly unlikely to happen. Think about that, 30 years on death row. 30 years waking up each morning wondering if today's the day. And it never is, and you start to hope it might not happen. But you can't be sure, so you exist in permanent limbo between life and death. Not sentenced to life in prison, sentenced to death, but not dead, just waiting for 30 years. Death row inmates at Kamiti are held in near total isolation. Cells measure roughly 6 feet by 9 feet, 54 square feet. Inmates spend 23 hours a day inside them, alone. No cellmate, no conversation, no interaction. Just you and 4 walls. No television, no radio, no books beyond a Bible or Quran if you want them. Nothing to occupy the mind, except the knowledge that you're supposed to be dead, and nobody knows if or when that sentence will be carried out. The psychological torture of indefinite death sentences is profound. You're told you're going to hang. You're treated as someone who's already dead, stripped of most privileges, cut off from the general prison population, held in isolation. But the execution never comes. Years pass, then decades. You're alive but treated as if you're not. You're sentenced to death but kept living. Eventually you start wondering which is worse, the execution or the waiting. Some death row inmates go insane, literally insane. Paranoid delusions, hallucinations, catatonia. Mental health deterioration so severe. They'd be institutionalized in a psychiatric facility if they weren't already locked in a cell. But Kamiti has minimal mental health services. Inmates who lose their minds often stay on death row, their condition worsening until they die of natural causes, or their appeals finally succeed decades later. Medical care is minimal. Kamiti's hospital is understaffed and undersupplied. Inmates with serious illnesses often go untreated. Tuberculosis is endemic, high rates across Kenya's prisons generally. Worse in Kamiti specifically, HIV/AIDS rates are high. Hepatitis spreads through shared needles and sexual contact. Mental health services are virtually non-existent, despite the psychological damage that decades in isolation inflict. You might see a counselor once every few months if you're lucky. More likely, never. Violence erupts periodically. In 2016, Kamiti experienced riots where inmates set fire to buildings and attacked guards. The unrest stemmed from overcrowding, poor conditions, and frustration at the glacial pace of court proceedings. That left many prisoners in legal limbo for years. Some prisoners had been waiting over a decade just to have their appeals heard. Waiting in isolation, waiting under death sentence, waiting for lawyers who might never come or courts that might never rule. Food is scarce and poor quality. Ugali cornmeal and beans, sometimes with vegetables, rarely meat. Never enough to fully satisfy hunger. Malnutrition isn't as severe as in some African prisons, but chronic hunger is a daily reality for most inmates. You get fed, just not enough, never quite enough. The perpetual hunger becomes psychological torture, added to the isolation, and the indefinite death sentence. What makes Kamiti particularly cruel is the combination of death sentences that aren't carried out in isolation that serves no purpose. You're isolated supposedly because you're too dangerous for the general population, but you're also not being executed. So you sit in a cell alone for decades, waiting for death or release, and neither ever comes, just day after day of isolation, year after year of not knowing, decade after decade of psychological torture disguised as waiting for justice. Kenya's Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that mandatory death sentences are unconstitutional. Some death row inmates got their sentences commuted to life in prison, but others remain under death sentences in a country that doesn't execute people. They remain in isolation, remain in limbo, remain waiting for an execution that probably won't happen but might. And that uncertainty destroys them more effectively than execution would. Carandiru Penitentiary in Sao Paulo was demolished in 2002, but its legacy remains as one of the deadliest prisons in modern history. The facility opened in the 1920s and eventually held over 8,000 inmates. In a complex designed for less than half that, the facility was designed as a model prison. Modern for its time, intended to set standards for humane detention in Brazil. By the 1990s, it had become a nightmare. On October 2, 1992, a riot erupted over prison conditions. Inmates took control of one pavilion. The riot started over typical prison grievances: overcrowding, poor food, violence, lack of medical care. Some accounts suggest it started specifically over a soccer match dispute between rival inmate groups. Doesn't matter. What matters is that inmates took control of Pavilion 9, and Sao Paulo authorities decided to retake it with overwhelming force. Sao Paulo military police were called in to retake the facility. What followed was a massacre. Police entered the pavilion with guns blazing. They shot inmates in cells, shot inmates trying to surrender, shot inmates already wounded on the ground. They executed prisoners. The operation wasn't a riot suppression, it was a slaughter. When the shooting stopped, 111 inmates were dead. Some were killed in the initial clash, most were executed afterward. Forensic evidence showed many victims were shot at close range, some multiple times, some while kneeling or lying down, execution-style killings. No police officers died, no police officers were seriously injured. It was a one-sided slaughter, armed police killing unarmed prisoners, who'd surrendered or were hiding in cells praying not to be found. The massacre drew international condemnation. Human Rights Watch called it one of the worst prison massacres in modern history. Amnesty International documented evidence of executions. The UN Human Rights Committee condemned Brazil. International pressure forced an investigation. Brazilian prosecutors eventually charged 74 military police officers with murder. Convictions came decades later. Some officers were found guilty, sentenced to prison. But most officers never served significant prison time. Appeals, legal maneuvers, delays. Some convictions overturned on technicalities, others reduced on appeal. The officers responsible for executing 111 inmates mostly walked free. Beyond the massacre, Carandiru's day-to-day conditions were horrific. Cells designed for a dozen inmates held 50 or more. 400 square feet divided among 50 people. 8 square feet per person. Barely room to lie down. And that's assuming perfect distribution, which never happened. Dominant inmates claimed more space. Weaker prisoners got less. Some slept standing up or in shift, because there literally wasn't floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. No sanitation, toilets backed up. Sewage flowed into cells. The smell was overwhelming. Guards wouldn't enter certain areas without masks. Inmates lived in filth. Garbage piled up, vermin infested everything. Rats, cockroaches, lice, bedbugs. Diseases spread unchecked: tuberculosis, hepatitis, HIV/AIDS. Inmates died from preventable illnesses at staggering rates. TB thrived in overcrowded conditions, where sick prisoners coughed into recycled air, everyone breathed. HIV spread through shared needles, sexual violence, and lack of education or prevention. Hepatitis spread similarly. Medical care was inadequate to non-existent. Inmates got sick and died. That was normal. Expected, nobody tried very hard to prevent it. Violence was constant. Gang-controlled cell blocks meant the strong ruled and the weak suffered. Murders happened weekly. Rival gang members killed each other over territory, drugs, insults. Rapes were common, sexual violence as assertion of dominance. Guards had lost control years before the 1992 riot. They collected bribes, facilitated drug smuggling, and looked the other way as inmates brutalized each other. Easier to let prisoners police themselves than intervene and risk getting killed. Sao Paulo's government finally demolished Carandiru in 2002, partly due to international pressure, partly because the facility had become so infamous it was unreformable. The massacre made Carandiru synonymous with prison brutality. Keeping it open meant continual international scrutiny and criticism. Easier to tear it down. Erase the physical reminder. Build new facilities and claim you've reformed. The buildings came down, but Brazil's prison crisis didn't end. The overcrowding moved to other facilities. The violence continued, the disease continued. Only the location changed. Brazil still has some of the most overcrowded, violent prisons in the world. Carandiru's demolition was symbolic. It removed one particularly notorious facility, but addressed none of the underlying causes of prison crisis. Not overcrowding, not gang control, not violence, not disease. Just knocked down some buildings and claimed progress. Carandiru's legacy lives in collective memory. Brazilians remember, the massacre is taught in schools. Documentaries preserve testimony from survivors. The facility might be gone, but what happened there isn't forgotten. It stands as a reminder of what can happen when prisons become overcrowded, violent, and out of control. When authorities respond to unrest with overwhelming force. When police execute unarmed prisoners and face minimal consequences. San Quentin State Prison sits on the San Francisco Bay, surrounded by some of the most expensive real estate in America. The facility opened in 1852, making it California's oldest prison. It currently holds roughly 3,700 inmates. But it's the condemned inmates on death row that makes San Quentin particularly grim. California's death row at San Quentin holds over 700 condemned inmates, the largest death row population in the Western Hemisphere. Like Kenya, California hasn't executed anyone in years. The last execution was in 2006. Legal challenges and political shifts have created a de facto moratorium. Governor Gavin Newsom declared a moratorium in 2019. So hundreds of men sit on death row waiting for executions that likely won't happen. Some have been there since the 1980s. 40 years on death row. 40 years in isolation waiting to die. Condemned inmates are held in East Block, a 5-tier cell house built in 1927. Cells are 4.5 feet by 11 feet, 49.5 square feet. Better than many prisons discussed here, still incredibly restrictive for 22 to 23 hours a day. Inmates spend those hours inside cells alone, unless they request a cellmate. Most don't, preferring solitude to the risk of violence or personality conflicts. No television in most cells. Limited personal property, books, letters, photos, that's about it. The tier is loud, metal on metal, voices echoing. The constant noise of hundreds of men confined in a space designed to amplify every sound. Concrete and steel architecture creates echo chambers. Someone yells on Tier 1 and it reverberates through all 5 tiers. Doors slam and the sound bounces off walls for seconds. Constant noise, never quiet, never peaceful. Sleep is difficult, concentration is impossible. The noise becomes psychological torture. Exercise happens in small yards surrounded by high walls. 1 hour a day if the facility isn't on lockdown. Lockdowns happen frequently. Any violence in the prison, any security threat, any staffing shortage can trigger a lockdown that keeps everyone in their cells for days or weeks. Lockdowns sometimes last months. You spend 24 hours a day in 49 square feet. No exercise, no shower, no phone calls, no programs. Just you and 4 walls until authorities decide the lockdown can end. Medical care has been the subject of federal lawsuits. California's entire prison healthcare system was placed under federal receivership in 2006. Due to conditions courts ruled unconstitutional. Prisoners were dying from preventable illnesses at rates that shocked federal judges. Cancer going undiagnosed, heart disease untreated. Diabetes managed so poorly inmates lost limbs. The state was so incompetent at providing health care that courts stripped California of control and gave it to a federal receiver. San Quentin's death row medical facilities are particularly problematic. Condemned inmates have died from preventable illnesses. Others have gone years without treatment for serious conditions. Cancer diagnoses delayed until the disease reached late stages. Heart conditions untreated until inmates suffered heart attacks. Psychiatric medications denied or arbitrarily discontinued, causing psychotic episodes. The condemned inmates include some of California's most notorious criminals, serial killers, mass murderers, but they also include men with serious questions about their guilt, men with strong appeals pending, men whose trials were tainted by prosecutorial misconduct or inadequate defense. DNA evidence has exonerated death row inmates. New witnesses have recanted testimony. Juries have come forward saying they were confused by instructions or pressured into verdicts. And all of them sit in 4.5 by 11-foot cells, waiting for a death that may never come or an exoneration that may arrive decades too late. Mental health deterioration is severe. Decades in isolation, even with limited human contact, produces psychological damage. Some inmates develop severe mental illness. Psychotic breaks, paranoid delusions. Believing guards are poisoning food or other inmates are plotting through vents. Catatonia, where inmates stop responding to external stimuli, sitting motionless for hours. San Quentin's mental health services are overwhelmed and inadequate for the scale of need. Too few psychologists, too few psychiatrists, too few treatment beds for inmates who need intensive care. California voters have repeatedly considered abolishing the death penalty. Ballot measures in 2012 and 2016 came close but failed. Some Californians want to keep capital punishment on the books even if it's not used. Others want to abolish it entirely. So death row remains, men remain condemned. So death row remains, men remain condemned. And everyone waits for political or legal resolution that might never come. San Quentin represents a particular American contradiction, maintaining a death penalty the state doesn't use, holding condemned prisoners in isolation for decades, spending millions on legal proceedings that rarely result in executions. Its expensive death penalty cases cost exponentially more than life without parole cases. Its inefficient appeals take decades, and it's arguably cruel. Decades of isolation waiting for death is arguably worse than execution itself. But the system persists because neither political side has enough support to change it. Budyaka Prison in Moscow opened in the 18th century and has operated almost continuously for over 200 years. It held prisoners under the Tsars, under Stalin's purges, through World War II and into modern Russia. The building itself is a relic, old, decaying and utterly unsuited for humane detention. Plumbing that barely works, electrical systems installed decades ago. Walls soaked with centuries of suffering. Budyaka is a transit prison, meaning inmates are held there temporarily before being sent to labor camps or other facilities. But temporary can mean months or years, while cases wind through Russia's overburdened court system. Trials get delayed, judges retire, cases get reassigned, and inmates remain at Budyaka, waiting in conditions that deteriorate as the building ages. Prisoners held at Budyaka describe conditions that would be shocking if they weren't so consistent with Russia's broader prison crisis. Cells designed for 10 inmates regularly hold 50 or more. 5 times capacity. Inmates sleep in shifts because there's no room for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Bunk beds stacked 3 or 4 high, inmates sleeping on floors. On tables, under tables, anywhere there's horizontal space. Tuberculosis is epidemic. Some estimates suggest 10 to 20% of inmates are infected. The disease spreads through overcrowded cells with poor ventilation and non-existent medical care. Coughing starts, spreads to cellmates, spreads to adjacent cells. Someone gets sick and infects 50 others, then those 50 infect 50 more. TB rates in Russian prisons are among the highest in the world, and Budyaka is among the worst facilities. Multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis is particularly common. TB strains that don't respond to standard antibiotics. Requires intensive treatment with expensive medications. Russian prisons don't have those resources, So inmates get infected with drug-resistant TB, receive inadequate treatment, and the bacteria continues spreading. Some die, others recover partially. All of them continue spreading resistant strains to new victims. Food is minimal: bread, thin soup, occasionally kasha, porridge. Malnutrition is common. Scurvy, a disease of vitamin C deficiency that was once confined to 18th century sailors, still occurs at Boudicca because inmates go months without fresh fruits or vegetables. Bleeding gums, loose teeth, skin problems, wounds that won't heal. All symptoms of scurvy in the 21st build a supermax prison based on a facility where human rights violations are documented and ongoing. Costa Rican President Rodrigo Chaves Robles toured CECOT in December 2025, and construction on the CECOT-inspired High Containment Center for Organized Crime, known as CACCO, began in 2026. Chaves visited the place where former detainees described being told they'd never see the light of day again, and went home to start building something modeled after it. He didn't just tour passively. He studied, took notes, asked questions, then announced Costa Rica would build its own version. Costa Rican Minister of Justice Gerald Campos Valverde had told journalists that Costa Rica would take all the good practices and see how we can bring them to a good conclusion in our legal system. Good practices, looking at a facility where half the inmates have no criminal record, according to some reports, where systematic torture has been documented, where 500 people have died in custody, where inmates are told they'll never see daylight again, and calling aspects of that good practices. Costa Rica abolished its military in 1948, used the money saved to build schools and hospitals. It's known for environmentalism, stability, democratic governance. It ranks high on global happiness indexes, has strong rule of law, independent judiciary, relatively low corruption. It's not supposed to be the kind of country that builds prisons modeled on facilities that international bodies have described as potentially constituting crimes against humanity. But CACCO is being built right now, fresh concrete being poured in 2026. Guard towers going up, electrified fencing being installed, high walls, restricted communication. All the features of CECOT's design being copied and implemented. And the model being followed: CECOT's isolation, CECOT's overcrowding. CECOT's restriction of all contact with the outside world has been condemned by every major human rights organization. Costa Rican officials insist their facility will be different: better oversight, better conditions, respect for due process. They point to Costa Rica's strong institutions, independent courts, free press, democracy. Those things will prevent abuses, they say. CACCO will have the security of CECOT without the human rights violations. Just the control, just the isolation, without the torture or deaths. But El Salvador made similar promises when CECOT opened. Ecuador made similar promises before El Encuentro started operations. And in both cases, the facilities opened with conditions that immediately drew international alarm. No family visits, no lawyer access, overcrowding beyond stated capacity, deaths in custody. The promises and the reality diverged quickly. The danger isn't just what happens at CACCO. It's what CACCO represents, the normalization of the CECOT model. If a democracy like Costa Rica can build this kind of facility, any country can justify it. If Costa Rica can look at CECOT's conditions and decide, we'll do that but better, then the threshold for what's acceptable has moved. The model becomes acceptable, expected. Standard practice for dealing with organized crime. Costa Rica faces real crime challenges. Drug trafficking, gang violence, organized crime using Costa Rica as a transit point between South American producers and North American markets. The government isn't wrong that crime is a problem. But building isolation supermax prisons doesn't address root causes, doesn't reduce drug demand, doesn't eliminate poverty that drives people to criminal enterprises, just warehouses the results in facilities designed to break people. What's particularly troubling is that Costa Rica has alternatives, resources, stable institutions, the capacity to invest in prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, but they're choosing the warehouse model. Choosing isolation and punishment, choosing CECOT's blueprint, not because they have no choice. They have choices, they're choosing this one. Construction continues through 2026. CACCO rises. And when it opens, when the first inmates are processed in, when families are denied visits, and lawyers are restricted to video calls, we'll see if Costa Rica's promises about better oversight hold up. We'll see if democracy and institutions prevent the abuses that characterized CECOT and El Encuentro. Or we'll see the same patterns replicate in a different country, with the same predictable results. In October 2025, Guatemalan President Bernardo Arévalo announced the construction of a prison modeled on CECOT. With a capacity of 2,000 inmates, Guatemala, a country still recovering from a brutal civil war, still dealing with endemic corruption, still struggling with weak institutions, decided the solution to its crime problems was a CECOT model supermax prison. Guatemala has some of the highest homicide rates in the Western Hemisphere. Gangs control neighborhoods. Drug cartels move product through the country. Violence is constant. Extortion, kidnapping, murder. The government isn't wrong that crime is a severe problem. But building isolation prisons doesn't address why gangs form, why people join them, why violence persists. Arévalo visited CECOT before the election, toured the facility, saw the conditions, and decided Guatemala needed something similar. Not we need to study what went wrong at CECOT and do better, but we need that. The appeal is obvious from a political standpoint: tough on crime, visible action, something concrete voters can see being built. But Guatemala's institutions are weak, judiciary is corrupt, police are infiltrated by organized crime. Prisons are already overcrowded and violent. Building a 2,000 capacity supermax doesn't fix those underlying problems, just concentrates them in one location. Guatemala's existing prisons are dominated by gangs. Inmates control cell blocks, guards fear entering certain areas, violence is routine. And the government's solution is to build a bigger, more restrictive prison, not reform the system, not address corruption, not invest in prevention, just build walls. The 2,000 inmate capacity is smaller than CECOT's 40,000, but still massive for Guatemala. 2,000 people in isolation conditions, 2,000 inmates with restricted family contact, 2,000 prisoners held in a facility modeled on a place where half the inmates may not have been convicted of any crime. Guatemala's judicial system is even weaker than El Salvador's. If El Salvador filled CECOT with people who hadn't been tried or convicted, Guatemala is likely to do the same. Construction hasn't been without opposition. Human rights organizations within Guatemala have protested. International bodies have expressed concern. But Arévalo's government proceeds. The political benefits of appearing tough on crime outweigh the concerns of human rights advocates, especially since those advocates often lack political power, and the public is desperate for solutions to violence. Guatemala represents the CECOT model spreading to an even weaker institutional environment. El Salvador at least had a government capable of maintaining control. Guatemala's government barely functions. Corruption is endemic. State capacity is limited. Taking the CECOT model and implementing it in Guatemala means all the isolation and control with even less oversight, even weaker accountability, even higher likelihood of abuse. In June 2024, Honduran President Xiomara Castro announced she would build a prison capable of holding 20,000 inmates. Modeled on CECOT, 20,000, Honduras, a country with a population of about 10 million, smaller than many US states, planning to warehouse 20,000 human beings in a single facility. Not distributed across multiple institutions, not with robust rehabilitation programs, not with adequate staffing. Just 20,000 people in a building complex modeled after a place where inmates are told they'll never see daylight again. Honduras has even weaker institutions than Guatemala. Higher corruption, more violence, less state capacity. The country has struggled with political instability for decades, coups, contested elections, economic crisis. And now this, a 20,000 capacity supermax prison. Castro visited CECOT, posed for photos with Bukele, praised his approach, went home and announced Honduras would build something even bigger. The political calculation is clear. Castro needs to address violence, and appearing tough on gangs plays well domestically. Doesn't matter if it actually works, matters if it looks like you're doing something. But 20,000 capacity exceeds even CECOT. Where will Honduras find 20,000 inmates to fill it? Mass arrests, sweeps, rounding up suspected gang members. That's how El Salvador filled CECOT. Honduras will likely follow the same path, which means thousands arrested without warrants, held without trial, disappeared into a mega prison where families can't visit and lawyers can't access them. Honduras already has some of the highest murder rates globally. Gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18 control territory. Extortion is ubiquitous. Police are corrupt and often collude with criminals. Prisons are violent and gang-controlled. Building a 20,000 capacity facility doesn't address any of that. just creates one enormous concentration of inmates in conditions likely to be as bad or worse than CECOT. The resources required to build and operate a 20,000 inmate prison are staggering. Construction costs, staffing, food, medical care, security. Honduras is one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere. Where's the money coming from? And if they do build it, what gets cut to pay for operation? Schools, healthcare, infrastructure. Castro's government insists the prison will be different. Better oversight, respect for rights, but Honduras has weaker rule of law than El Salvador. Less capacity for oversight, more corruption. If CECOT operates with human rights violations, despite El Salvador's relatively stronger institutions, what will happen in Honduras with weaker institutions? The 20,000 capacity prison hasn't been built yet, might never be. Announcements are easy, construction is hard, funding could fall through, political priorities could shift. But the announcement itself matters. It signals that Honduras sees CECOT as a model worth copying. That size and security trump rights and rehabilitation. That warehousing 20,000 people in isolation is an acceptable response to crime. Honduras represents the extreme end of CECOT replication. Not just copying the model, exceeding it, building something even bigger. Taking all the problematic elements of CECOT and scaling them up. If it gets built, if it opens, if 20,000 inmates end up inside, that will be the largest supermax prison in the world. The most extreme implementation of isolation and control. And if it works politically, if other leaders see Castro succeed, the model spreads further. Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly called Angola, which has been criticized repeatedly for its ruthless conditions, is located in Cancer Alley, a stretch of land where rates of cancer caused by air pollution exceed the federal government's limits of acceptable risk. That fact alone tells you something. The prison sits in a location so contaminated that simply being there increases cancer risk, and it's deliberate. Nobody accidentally builds a prison in Cancer Alley. They chose that location. Angola sprawls across 18,000 acres of former plantation land. 18,000 acres, that's 28 square miles, bigger than many towns. The irony, or perhaps the honest continuation, is impossible to miss. Enslaved people once worked this land. Now prisoners do, many of them black men serving life sentences, working in fields for pennies an hour or nothing at all. Same fields, same work, different legal justification. The facility holds roughly 6,300 inmates. Most are serving life sentences. Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate in the United States, which has the highest incarceration rate in the world. And Angola is Louisiana's end-of-the-line facility. If you're sent there, you're probably dying there. 75% of Angola inmates are serving life sentences. They'll never leave except in coffins. Violence at Angola has been historically extreme. Stabbings, murders, rapes. The prison's reputation as one of the bloodiest in America wasn't earned through exaggeration. For decades, Angola was essentially ungovernable. Guards were outnumbered and outgunned. Inmates ruled entire dormitories. Some areas of the prison were no-go zones for staff. Guards walked the perimeter but didn't enter certain buildings because doing so meant risking death. Reforms in the 1990s and 2000s reduced some of the violence. Better staffing, reorganized housing. Religious programs. Angola has its own seminary where lifers can become ordained ministers. The violence dropped but didn't disappear. Inmates still die, fights still break out. Sexual violence remains underreported and underprosecuted. The reforms made Angola less deadly, didn't make it safe. Angola's healthcare system has faced long-standing criticisms for severe neglect. Inmates have reported not receiving basic medical attention, leading to preventable amputations, deaths from untreated conditions, and years-long waits for critical surgeries. Men lose limbs from infections that could have been treated with antibiotics, die from cancers that could have been caught early with routine screening, wait years for surgeries that should happen within weeks. The environmental location adds another layer of harm. Cancer Alley's petrochemical plants pump toxins into the air. Inmates breathe those toxins day after day, year after year. They develop respiratory illnesses, cancers, cardiovascular disease. And then they can't get adequate treatment because the prison healthcare system is overwhelmed and underfunded. So they're exposed to carcinogens, develop cancer, and die without adequate treatment. That's not accidental. That's systematic neglect rising to the level of cruelty. Angola also pioneered the hospice program that other prisons now copy. Inmate hospice workers care for dying prisoners because Angola has so many lifers who will die behind bars. Inmates train as hospice workers, provide end-of-life care to fellow prisoners. Sit with dying men in their final hours. It's presented as compassionate. And maybe it is, relative to letting men die alone in cells. But it's also an admission we've incarcerated so many people for so long that we need an entire system to handle the ones who die here. The hospice exists because Angola is a death sentence for most inmates. Not death penalty, just death. Life in a contaminated location with inadequate health care until cancer or violence or old age kills you. Then other prisoners provide hospice care. Then you die. Then you're buried in the prison cemetery because your family can't afford to claim your body. Hundreds of graves, inmates buried on the same land where enslaved people were buried. Different century, same dirt. Angola represents American mass incarceration at its most extreme. Highest incarceration rate in the world. Inmates serving life sentences for nonviolent crimes. Because Louisiana has mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws. Men dying in a prison built on a plantation in Cancer Alley. The cruelty isn't hidden, it's policy. And it continues because Louisiana voters keep supporting tough-on-crime politicians. And nobody with power cares enough to change it. Alabama Appleseed mass incarceration. Alabama Appleseed State Prison Report Summary. Alabama Appleseed 4 years after the DOJ warning. Alabama Reflector, Alabama State Prison population could rise by 1/3 by 2030. Britannica CECOT, construction owners completion of Alabama's $1.25 billion Elmore Prison delayed to late 2026. Correctional News 2025 projects to watch. Dwell. Is dignified jail design even possible? EJI new reporting on Alabama's unsafe and inhumane prisons. Freedom for All Americans, 17 worst prisons in the U.S. in 2026. HM prison inside CECOT, El Salvador's mega prison, where 500 plus have died in custody. Howard Legg new prisons are not being built with rising temperatures in mind. IACHR urges Ecuador to take effective action against ongoing prison violence. NACLA militarizing Ecuador's prisons has failed. NILC tracking the CECOT disappearances. PRISM reports states are building new women's prisons. The Cuenca Dispatch inside Ecuador's new high-security prison. Tribune Net PH Ecuador eyes more mega prisons amid trafficking surge. Vera Institute building prisons on toxic land has devastating consequences. Verfassungsblog security cells El Salvador's mega prison as an export model. Wikipedia El Encuentro prison. Wikipedia inside CECOT. Wikipedia Terrorism Confinement Center. WS